Hello and welcome to the British Dapper, and today we're looking at the differences between fashion and traditional style. This video has been prompted by a contribution by one of my subscribers, and that's through John, and he asked a question along the lines of what's the difference between fashion and traditional style. And so it's quite a complicated question in a way. Fashion is codependent on tradition, and tradition evolves into the new form of fashion. So to explain that in a little bit more depth, just think about where things have come from. So if we were to stay traditional in everything we do, then we would never evolve, and therefore if we apply that principle, then why aren't we still wearing tri-hats, and why aren't we still wearing wigs and three-quarter coats and cravats and pantaloons, let alone what about tights and men's high heels? So as time goes by, new innovations come in, and then we have, for example, Regency, where we have a completely different look, where they ditched the wigs and they changed the way that people look. It's a much more relaxed look. And so why don't we still wear those things? Well, because things evolve, and the thing that makes it evolve is people that look at fashion, people that create something that challenges or goes against tradition. So, and fashion's that vehicle that does that. But fashion doesn't just do it. It also needs to have the back catalogue, if you like, of what has historically been before. So, for example, Oxford bags is an example. In the 1920s, when we were in a period of world stability or relative stability, and fiscally not that badly off as a country, we saw the introduction of Oxford bags. Now you might think how weird this might be, and why would we introduce it? Well, it's because it was a change and it was a trend and it drew attention. Now you might think, well, that's where it ended up, but not really, because if you look at it, maybe later on in the late 1960s, early 1970s, we then get the introduction of Oxford bags again, and this time it's in with the movement of Northern Soul dancing. And from that we also get the evolution of flares in the 70s. Now you might say, well, flares, they'll never come back. But in the 2000 period we end up with bootcut jeans as an example, and bootcut trousers, which is a milder version of those flared jeans or those flared trousers. So things evolve, but they get reinvented, recreated, and brought into the modern era again. So it's this constant cycle of old and fresh and new that keeps evolving and rolling on. For example, where somebody says they like to dress traditionally in a classical or a time where things don't change, and well, that was very nice to think like that, but fashion does evolve, and so does the look, and unfortunately with that, so does some of the materials used, because we move into a more modern era where people can't afford the original materials used historically. So we find cheaper ways of doing it, cheaper ways of manufacturing it, and so things evolve. Now there are those traditionalists that say they want to stay with a certain look. Now, when I say that, for example, a suit is pretty much a suit, but over the decades it has evolved, changed, it's restricted and contracted in its look. So if we go back to the 1930s as an example, just before the Second World War, quite an opulent period worldwide, and we see quite large lapels being used. We see, for example, double-breasted suits. We see double-pleated trousers with turn-ups, all very lavish, lots of fabric being used. But then we move into the Second World War, and after the Second World War, where things like materials are being restricted and not so easily available, then we see style generally changing to much more slimline, tighter fitting materials and clothes being made to obviously conserve the amount of materials being used. And that influences the fashion, or the fashion influences the use of those materials and the cut and the designs used. For example, lapels are no longer wider, they become narrower and narrower to reduce the amount of material being used. And that's basically the fiscal restraints put upon somebody as well, not just the material side of it. So when we then move into a more opulent period, for example in the UK, we were rationed right up until the 1955, I believe, and from that point onwards suddenly we start seeing lapels getting a little bit wider on men's jackets, pleats start to come in again, slightly looser, baggier fit. We then eventually end up with double-breasted suits back again in much more common production, if you like, and use. And then we hit into the 70s. Now in the 60s we end up with mod outfits which are quite narrow lapels, quite highly buttoned up, so in fact you end up with this type of effect, and that's all again sort of in the tail end of shortages as such. So in the 70s again we start seeing wide lapels coming in, and this is because fashion rebels against the previous, so where we had narrow lapels, they then start going to the other extreme. So fashion is always the extreme end. So when you see Vivienne Westwood and other famous designers, they're quite adventurous and very bold with their statement pieces, and that's not necessarily the end result. When you go to the high street and buy something, it won't end up looking like that. It'll be slightly diluted and changed for the market. But the examples are where historically we've had narrow lapels, we start getting very bold lapels. Now in reality you might end up with something a little bit in between from a manufacturing point of view, because they don't want to push it too far to the extreme. But this is all interlinked, because those wide lapels were there originally in the 30s. Now again they come back again, maybe in the 70s, in a completely different style, where we've now got flared trousers and we've got wider lapels and we've got long collared shirts, kipper ties, because the width of the lapel has changed, then the width of the tie changes to mimic that. And these are all ongoing changes. So when somebody says to me, what's your style? Well, my style is probably, I would describe as classical, which is a middle of the road. So it's not going to be adventurously bold with the lapels, or or too narrow on the lapels. It's trying to find that middle ground. The same with the shirts, not too long a collar, not too short a collar, and same with the tie width, not too narrow and not too broad. So it's just trying to find that middle ground all the time, and that goes down to also the shoes as well. So for shoes, I try and find something that's quite a common look, an Oxford, or I go for a brogue, and I tend to go for a chisel toe look rather than a rounded look. And it's pretty much in a way timeless, because when, for example, we've got narrow lapels, mine will be a little bit wider but not really broad, and vice versa. When fashion goes broad, I don't want to go narrow, but mine's in the middle all the time, so it never really goes into fashion and never really comes out of fashion, because it just seems to fit that middle ground all the time. And so that's really where I'm coming from. So I think if you always try and find that middle ground, then you're not really fashionable and you're not really traditional. If you're traditional, and I know this, a lot of people are almost like historians. They wear a certain look from a certain era. For example, the 30s and 40s. So you'll see them wearing trilby hats or fedora hats. They will be wearing suits, three-piece suits. They will be wearing tie pins and ties and mimicking a look back to those days. They may even have the suits made from the same materials to that extent. But again, that's what they like. And I would say to anybody, whether you're fashionable or you're classical in your looks, the thing is to pick the look that suits you, what you feel comfortable in. So if you like wide lapels, then what's wrong with that? If you like narrow lapels, then go with that. But it's no good trying to, in a way, look older than you are or look younger than you are. That ends up being a little bit unusual, and people will remark more on that than what you're actually wearing. So if you're, for example, in your 50s, 60s and 70s, you're not going to wear something like this, where it's very much a young person's look, and something that you would just look really weird wearing. It's all about fitting in and looking good for your age. So dress appropriately for your age. So I know it's a very difficult subject to cover today, but these are just my initial thoughts on when we talk about fashion to traditional style. And they do interweave and they do work together. So for example, when fashion people look at a new fresh look, they look at what has historically been there. Sometimes they reintroduce something that's come from the history and refresh it and change it and adapt it for the modern market, for that different look. So you always get that jarring effect between traditional and fashion coming together, and they are symbiotic in a way. They do need each other in a way, because even traditional clothing will evolve over time, because the people that dress that way become older, and so the younger individuals, people that are in their 20s and 30s now, in 10, 20 years time, 30 years time, the fashion will have evolved, but if they stay wearing the same sort of clothes for their age, they haven't changed. Their look then becomes traditional or classical. So it's an ever evolving process, not just fashion, but even the traditional side does evolve. Because if it didn't, then why aren't we wearing those Regency looks? Why are we still not wearing the tri-hats? And why are we not wearing those pantaloons and tights and high heels? So if you enjoyed the video, give us a thumbs up. If you'd like to subscribe, then please feel free to do so. Our next video is going to be on a slightly different theme. We're looking at introducing the colour green into a suit or a jacket ensemble. Very similar to the previous video we did on introducing yellow. So until next time, take care.